welcome everyone. I think we're going to have a very lively conversation today about lessons from the Southwest Airlines fiasco. We're going to be speaking about technical debt and internal customers, things that are on a lot of folks' minds right now, I believe. So we have two panelists joining us today here at 280 Group. We have Joe Ghali and Elad Simon, I believe. Why don't you both just take a moment to introduce yourselves?
Hey everyone, my name is Joe Ghali. I'm a principal consultant and trainer with 280 Group. I'm calling in from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the product management space for 20 years, and I'm really excited to be part of this opportunity.
Hi everybody. Hi everyone, I'm Elad Simon. I'm the CEO of Craft.io. Been in the product management space and the management space for about 15 years or so, and excited to be here as well and talk about technical debt. And also, as you can see, my beard is a little bit trimmer. I've decided to work on that as a preparation for the webinar.
All right, I'm Robin Brooks, Director of Product Management here at 280 Group, and excited to be your host for today. All right. So at 280 Group, we offer full circle product management and product marketing solutions. We are excited to host today. Just a little bit more about us. We offer training and workshops, team and individual coaching, product lifecycle templates, strategic consulting, foundational training and certifications, all centered around our optimal product process methodology. If you're interested in learning more about us, there'll be a link in the chat. And just a little bit about Craft.io. Elad, do you want to speak to this just for a moment?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for that, Robin. So Craft.io is a product management platform which empowers product teams to build great products with confidence. We are excited to be here today and hopefully interest you with talking about technical debt and internal customers.
Great. All right, and we are eager to hear your questions as soon as we can get that working, hopefully any minute now. And also, the main question we always get is, can you watch this later? We understand everyone is busy. Yes, you will receive a link if some of your colleagues weren't able to join us live. Yeah, we're looking forward to circulating this after the session is over. And with that, why don't we jump in, and I will hand it over to you, Joe.
Yeah, hey everyone. I think some of you may have seen my blog post. If you hadn't, we'll follow up. So I was one of the many that were stranded over the holidays, taking a flight back from Providence, Rhode Island to Milwaukee, and on the drive back, it made me think about some lessons we can gain from what happened with Southwest Airlines over the holidays. In terms of really understanding, what can we leverage, or how can we be better as product professionals? And when we look at Southwest, I don't want to dive into the details. There were really two things that really stuck out to me as a product leader, and one of them was, hey, their infrastructure could not handle what was happening during that time of the year with the bad weather, the holidays, the increase in demand. We had many flight attendants and pilots calling in sick, so their system just couldn't handle what happened, and as a result, they had to shut down for a couple of days and reset. So crazy as it was inspirational for me, and I'm really excited for this opportunity because we're going to cover two big topics. One is around how do you manage technical debt, and the other one is around how to understand your internal customers. All right, and it looks like the Q&A works, or the chat works,
and the chat works. Everything works.
So I think we're set. So thank you from the folks behind the scenes that are helping us out. No, that is not me with the backpack, but that could have easily been me over the holidays. All right, the next slide. All right, so tech debt, right? What is it? It has a bad name. I was thinking about this today, and I'm like, gosh, I wonder what would happen if we gave it a more friendly name. I know in my previous experiences, I've used the term product lifecycle, but for those who are newer to this concept, tech debt, as the slide says, it's the interest you pay to keep your technology current. It's something that just isn't avoidable, right? It's always growing. Think of it like buying an item on a credit card, there's always interest that's accumulating. And so much like, making sure you stay current with your credit card bill or making sure you stay current with visiting the dentist or the doctor, it requires ongoing, a little bit of tender loving care, right? There's constant refactoring. It's not exactly the glitziest work for any engineer, but if you manage it from a budget perspective, it can definitely be manageable, because ultimately, when I try to work with leaders and different organizations in our workshops and our classes, it should never be an either or discussion. It should be an and. I want to do the big, new, and shiny, and I want to be able to pay down our tech debt. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to kick off with our first poll question, and we want to know, from the audience, how do you handle tech debt?
Okay, the poll should be active.
It is.
Excellent.
And this is just as a reminder, as we're doing the poll question, we want to take your questions throughout the webinar. So please, we have Robin on the call here. She's going to help keep Elad and I as honest as possible with all your great questions.
Okay.
Drum rolls. Results are in. Results are in.
And it's a really interesting split. So let me share these results so everyone can see. And yeah, so it looks like nearly half allocate capacity during roadmap and planning, at least some capacity, which is great. Many, about 17% allocate that capacity during sprint execution. So kind of having a rolling list, it sounds like. And then 29% deal with it as it arises and take a velocity hit. And I think that's fairly common. And I love the 7% who were honest enough to say they ignore it for as long as possible.
There's many more than 7%.
They're not alone.
They're just a brave 7%. That's all.
That's the 7% bravest folks, I think, on the call. So kudos to you.
So Robin, why don't you go ahead and kick us off with some of the questions? I know we had some coming up during the call.
Yeah, we do have a few coming in. So let's take a look here. Okay, so what is the right percentage of a sprint to allocate to tech debt? That is the golden question, right?
Elad, I'll let you start off that one.
Sure. That's I think I think like many answers we're gonna answer in this specific thing about tech debt. The short answer is gonna be it depends. And I really think it depends on the maturity of the product and where you guys are from a debt perspective. I think in a lot of companies, especially when you start a new product, things are not as let's say as like tech debt is not as prevalent or not as dramatic as as you will see in more mature product. So I don't think there's like a magic number. I mean, the number I have stuck in my head, but really is just a random number. Honestly, it's like anywhere between 15 to 30%. Like for me, that's like a ballpark number of what you would put in for anything to do with like bugs and as like ongoing technical debt work. But if you're in a company that its stack is super old, and if you don't do refactoring, you're gonna get stuck in the mud and you will not be able to change anything, and you're not gonna be able to do any progression because you're stuck from a debt perspective. Then it might take 80% of your sprint. And on the flip side of it, if you are in a company, if you just started a new product from scratch, in the latest and greatest, front end and back end technologies, etc., you might not have any. So it really is kind of like, unfortunately, it depends kind of thing, at least from my side perspective. With again, as a ballpark, I would say anywhere between 15 and 30% would be a common response you hear rather than the right answer for you specifically, whoever asked that question. I don't know.
So it sounds like you need to do a little bit of internal discussion around where your product is in the product lifecycle, like Joe mentioned, right? And determine kind of what is the interest rate on your technical debt. So you make sure that you're paying it down. I'm curious. Go ahead.
No, go.
Yeah. So a couple folks are interested in knowing how do you convince your leadership to invest velocity in paying down technical debt, because that sounds like something that some folks struggle with. I know we've all experienced, having to make the case for, especially if you want to pay down some of it, use a larger amount of velocity to actually pay down some of that technical debt so you can lower your interest rate.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of our stakeholders and realize when they're questioning us, they're not doing it out of spite. They're doing it because probably there's a strategy that they're being held accountable for. And so, if we get pushback, we have to almost empathize with our stakeholders like we empathize with our users and our customers. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. So what I've seen work well for me in the past is, as we are in that planning process, as we begin to figure out what our plan is or how we're going to solve for a particular problem, I've always found it helpful to bring your stakeholders and your leaders along with you in the journey. Help them understand how, a shortcut today will have an impact in the future in terms of, hey, yes, we may make some shortcuts and hack to get to a certain delivery. But then on the back end of that means in 3 to 5 months or 6 months, we're going to have to fix it. So the more that we can be transparent, build trust, and really explain the impact, Southwest isn't the only company that's ever suffered from not paying attention to their tech debt. There are hundreds of companies that we deal with on a daily basis. We just probably don't realize it. So the more you can be transparent, the more you can bring them along in the journey. There are definitely articles out there that talk about the impact. I think those are some of the best techniques, at least from my perspective. Elad, anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. The topic of let's say positioning technical debt in the company and helping people understand why it's important is it's a fascinating topic, because it's a little bit like going to the gym. It's like it's the thing that we all know conceptually it's right and we should do it, and it's good for us. But if you look at the humanity on average, I guess a lot of people end up not going to the gym, and it's because of that kind of there's a very clear tendency for all of us to prioritize short-term gains over long-term gains, right? So that's really kind of one of those big issues with technical debt, because it's not always imminent. In the case of Southwest, it became very imminent, right? So everything broke down. But in many cases, when you look at technical debt, actually, sometimes there is a healthy balance, right? So it's not like you always have to overinvest in it and this is why I think to Joe's point, absolutely taking the leadership and the executive team through the journey of explaining, if we don't invest, a healthy portion, and whatever that number may be, that, it could be the 10% or the 15 or the 20 or the 30, if we don't invest a healthy portion of that on an ongoing basis, there's going to be a moment in time where we're going to have no progression or extremely, extremely frustrating progression. What do you want to do? Do you prefer this model or do you prefer that model? And by the way, it is eventually a choice. Like everything else, it is eventually a choice. You can also decide, you ignore it for a bit and then you overcome it. And, there's you can do this on an ongoing basis. You can do this in peaks and troughs. It really is at the hands of in my mind, eventually the hands of the leadership. There's not one recipe that fits all. Sometimes, I'm a CEO of a growing startup, and sometimes you have to do progression, because if you don't do progression, then, you might not get your next customer in, and that might be tactically right and strategically wrong from a tech debt perspective, but, that's the thing you have to do right now. And so this is really one thing, and really to Joe's point, really something you have to bring the balance to the leadership team to say, hey, these are the options, these are the alternatives. I think ignoring tech debt, and the bravest we spoke about in our poll, ignoring it completely is something that I just wouldn't do wholeheartedly, because eventually it will bite you. It's just a question of when, but eventually it's gonna bite you. I mean, I was in a company at some point that any feature progression, like anything, literally anything, you want to add a column into a table view, that would take 3 months to do. Like anything would take like 3 months of development, and it was because the technical debt was so big, and it was the system was so old that it just couldn't handle any more changes. And so and that's really kind of like the place you really don't want to get into. But absolutely take people through the journey. And to Joe's, again, to the point you mentioned earlier, using stories like Southwest and others, by the way, Southwest is really an extreme version of like a big kerfuffle that happens because of technical debt. But there's a lot of other mini horror stories that you can also share with management, not to necessarily terrorize them into decision making, but really into kind of understanding the implications in a more storytelling way, not just in terms of like this is the right thing to do. Sometimes that's sometimes that's a motivator.
There was another really good question that I think kind of speaks to this overall category that we're talking about around technical debt. How do you differentiate between what is considered traditional technical debt, the things that need to be invested in the product itself, versus infrastructure, right, or architectural debt, as some call it. Is that all the same category, and are they related? And then how do you differentiate when you're diagnosing the sale failure has happened, like it did to Southwest? How do you determine whether it was technical debt on the product or related to infrastructure that hasn't scaled correctly?
I mean, to me, they're one and the same. Right, it's the foundation. It's like if you think about your home, you have your plumbing and your electrical, right? You have to, if you want to add the man cave, you first have to upgrade the electrical or maybe even the plumbing, right? They work in tandem with each other. So in the case of Southwest, and I know this because I worked with them many years ago. They were frugal with their platform. To their credit, their focus was on providing value. They were a low-cost carrier. They were penny pinchers. Herb Keller was a genius. But as we sometimes forget, they also acquired AirTran. They acquired AirTran because they wanted their technology, because they knew their technology was getting antiquated. And so, where a lot of organizations sometimes struggle is even in those mergers and acquisitions is, you're trying to figure out how to get these two systems together, or you're trying to figure out how to retire an older system. And I think, in the case of Southwest, they forego, they looked at the new and shiny, and what they didn't do is they didn't keep their infrastructure current. It could be the code base, it could be the security patches, it could just be the technology. When I worked in Frontech, we used a solution called Bootstrap to build a responsive web. We had to upgrade from Bootstrap 4.0 to 6.0, right? There was inherent risks to the business if we didn't. There were vulnerabilities. And so technical debt is more of an umbrella term, whether it's on the front end side or even on the back end side.
Yeah, and to add to that, Joe, and I completely agree with you. And to add to that, for me, that question almost indicates like different responsibilities, and that's what I'm really worried. That's where this mindset really worries me, in the sense that you can think of technical debt on the product side, and then technical debt on the R&D or development side, where it's like more architectural. But the reality is that eventually, unless there's a really big unless there's a really big infrastructure team that works completely separately from development, but even in that case, product. And this is why we're having this conversation, with product folks. Product eventually needs to look at the big picture and say, like, these are all eventually risks that can drag me down, slow me down, prevent me from progression, and sometimes bring to my demise or collapse. And so it doesn't really matter. Is that because I didn't upgrade to the latest technology on the front end? or backend, or is that because I haven't thought through my my feature set as of yet? It's really not about this is the responsibility of this team and this is the responsibility of that team. Technical debt really is this umbrella kind of concept, and I actually like the term because it resonates well with me, the concept of debt, because it's one of those things that you have to take care of. It's not like debt is something that you really have to take care of, rather than you're just gonna if you ignore debt for too long, eventually you're going to be in trouble, kind of thing. And I think that's where the analogy kind of works. And so I definitely wouldn't separate those two into different things.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat, Robin. I saw it, in terms of how do we establish that the root problem is technical debt? I can go a little bit deeper on this just briefly. So basically there's scheduling systems, right? This is where they were trying to figure out where to place pilots and the flight attendants. Their scheduling system wasn't on an older platform, like it hadn't been updated, right? It was, behind the scenes it was working, but it couldn't handle the size of all the changes that were happening at once. I know it's the term gets used a lot, but the perfect storm. But when you look at the weather changes, flight crew being out, and then their system, all those things happening at once, it couldn't handle it. So when we talk about the root cause, I don't want to say, and this is not fair of me to even say this, it's not the only reason, but it's a contributing cause to what happened to them over the holidays, right? And we're gonna go into the internal customer piece of it, but this was not anything. No one that was an employee at Southwest was frankly surprised by this, because they knew that their system was older, right? Many of us have worked at organizations where we're coming in and we're like, goodness gracious, this is, was this built during DOS? Was this Windows 3.0? Many of us still work at companies where the technology just hasn't been updated because you've been able to skate by. So that was one of the causes to what happened to Southwest.
Yeah, so seems like a good segue to start talking about internal customers and how Southwest, even when they were investing in their platform and their technology and their products to keep them up to date, their focus was more on their external paying customers than their internal customers. So it seems like a good time to transition into that conversation, because that definitely weighs when you're trying to talk to leadership about where to invest.
Yeah. So, we talk about internal customers. Let's first kind of level set a little bit. This is customer service. Customer service are your representatives. They are your front line. They're your internal customers. It could be people in accounting, people in finance, your sales team, anyone that you enable them the ability to deliver value to your external customers. Those are your internal customers. And as the slide says, they are extremely critical to your success, right? Because their ability to delight and serve your customers, your paying customers, is really predicated on your ability to make their life easier, right? How quickly can they get back to that user? How quickly can the user complete their task or get help is really predicated on the internal customers. And I think, again, just based off of what I've read, this type of feedback had been given to Southwest upper management for many years. The system was slow. They were doing some items behind the scene to try to get by, but ultimately this was feedback that was ignored for a long time, and they paid the price for it over the holidays.
Yeah, and by the way, Joe, and for me, that's really it's a good segue, but it really is like not the same as technical. It's related, of course, and that's why we kind of bundled this together when we talked about this the Southwest issue. It's related, but it's not specifically tech. Like, the issue of the internal customer is not just about tech debt. It really is. It's on its own a thing. And while we can, of course, connect the two dots together, there's something about that internal customer, and I guess that's kind of like while we're talking about this. There's something about this internal customer that is almost by definition, or like almost always, at least in a lot of the companies I see, is kind of neglected, right? So left aside, or like, that's not the priority. And so, I'd love to talk a little bit about that. I don't know if we have questions about that, or I can just like jump into it. But that's for me, that's one of the things that is really fascinating about the internal customer problem. I don't know if we have any more slides on this, but
I think that's the only slide.
cool.
So
All right, let me launch the poll here. We've got another question. So how do you prioritize your internal customer work at your organization, whether it's your direct responsibility or not? How do you prioritize internal customers versus external customers?
Okay, let's see what we got.
All right. So we have about 60% allocate that capacity during roadmap and planning, about 10% who do it during sprint execution, about 23% who deal with it as it arises, and another brave 7% saying they ignore their internal customers for as long as possible. I'm really glad we have some honest folks on the webinar today.
I wonder if it's the same people. We ignore both. We ignore both the, we're just gonna do progression and we'll just see how it goes.
Okay.
So another good question in chat is how do you design a product process that handles this really well? How do you prioritize and technical debt? How do you empathize with internal customers like you do with external customers, and reserve and allocate the right amount of capacity to paying attention to each of these things while balancing the velocity that the business expects to achieve the business outcomes?
Elad, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'll start. I'll start if it's okay. So I think, by the way, this is a really interesting point about basically about prioritization and how do you prioritize and how do you prioritize? I mean, technical debt and of course the internal customer as part of this process. The way I saw it happening, and there's a lot of prioritization methodologies out there in the world, right? So if there's a RICE or ICE or WSJF or Moscow, or there's quite a lot of them. The one thing I would say is that I would at least have like one of the prioritization, let's say, permutations around kind of buckets. And I like the buckets kind of concept because I really believe that really helps at least float if there are any gaps that you are willing or not willing to live with, right? So, and what I mean by that, what I mean by the buckets concept, like for example, imagine you break down, and this is something I saw in an article on Reforge recently. Like if you break down an article, if you take your work and you break it down to 4 buckets, one is like feature work, one is growth work, one is around like scale or technical debt, and one is around like things that help you with like catching up with competition, etc. If you have those buckets and then you break down your work to those buckets, you are then able to visualize to the people who are responsible for the decision making. Are you taking anything? Are you doing anything on this or that, right? So because the challenge with a lot of the prioritization methodologies I've seen in the past is that if you look at it line by line perspective, sometimes in many cases the progression kind of features always win. The new shiny features, they might always win on any type of prioritization methodology you do, because in many cases they'll get a lot of kind of perceived value because people always are optimistic about how much value this feature is going to bring in the future and all that kind of stuff. But when you use the bucket methodology, then you're saying, hey, I know that I'm not neglecting anything, so that's like, I think for me that's like a really nice approach to do that. An alternative, by the way, and again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Joe. An alternative is to also embed within your prioritization framework, always embed things like risk management, as part of your priorities, so that if something is poses a potential inherent risk, it gets bumped up in the score. Because in a lot of cases, if you just do the simple, must have, should have, could have, won't have kind of prioritization, the internal customers are always going to be on the, they're going to be on the bottom, at the bottom of those, at the bottom of on the right hand side of those lists. I don't know, Joe, what you think.
Yeah, no. I could not agree with you more. I mean, one that comes to mind, again, everyone has their own preference, but the prioritization method that comes to mind is WSJF. For those who aren't aware, it's a weighted shortest job first, and it takes 4 criteria. And one of those criteria is something called risk reduction and opportunity enablement. And so when I work with product leaders and product managers, I tell them that, hey, although this item that's tech debt may score low on business value, it will score much higher in that risk reduction or opportunity enablement, which is why I'm a big fan, personally, just from my own experiences at previous organizations. That's why I like having that particular method for prioritization. Now, the key is, and I think Eli would agree with me, prioritization is more art than science. You can't just take the number and say, well, this one was higher than the other one. You have to look at the strategic goals of the organization. You have to account for dependencies. So it's a little bit more complicated, but that's why I like incorporating that risk component into any prioritization method.
Yeah, I agree, John. And I think that's kind of what I was kind of alluding to, that I think eventually prioritization needs to be done with multiple lenses.
Yes.
Right. So like if you just use a single lens, whichever lens is going to be, by the way, it's going to lend itself towards something. And you see that in a lot of cases. And of course, we work with a lot of product teams here, and it's obviously could be a very like nightmare kind of exercise to say, no, instead of just like adopting one methodology, you need to adapt multiple methodologies of prioritization to your organization. Right? That's like agreeing on one with a group of product managers. It's difficult enough kind of thing. But the reality is that if you don't do that, and if you don't actually slice and dice the data in different lenses, you're going to miss out on things. You might end up doing things that are completely off your OKRs, for example, or you might completely neglect your internal customer, for example, right? So, and that's really kind of one of those things where having those multiple lenses is so critical for the success of the product organization. And rather than just like having a very like single dimensional kind of approach to doing prioritization. The other thing I would say, and by the way, and we see, and Joe, you and I have been, we know each other for quite some time, and we've been seeing a lot of companies jointly, I would say. In some companies, you actually have people, dedicated teams to handle the internal customer, right? So exactly for that reason, because I think there is an understanding, and I think probably Southwest got the balance somewhere wrong in that sense. There is an understanding that if you bundle it all into one team that does, both the consumer, let's say the consumer experience, as well as the internal business needs of the organization, in all likelihood, the shiny, cool, consumer, glitzy stuff is gonna get, even if you got all the prioritization methodologies right, eventually, because it's glitzy, because senior management loves it, because it's the consumer, like people are gonna have a more affinity towards that. And that's why sometimes, again, I'm not saying it's always right for every company, but sometimes the right thing to do is to actually segregate a team dedicated for this thing. Otherwise, it might get neglected. I don't know if you have any, I'm sure you've seen this.
It's really interesting. I'm actually teaching one of our public OPM, our introduction to product management. And, as you're talking about this, it made me think about, and this is a question a gentleman named Sean in the chat asked this about, stakeholders and their eagerness for profitability. You got to start with the basics. Like I always tell product leaders, do you have a persona built for your internal customer? Do you have a customer journey map? Where in their journey to complete their work are they getting pain points? Where are they struggle? And then the key is to quantify it. Right? Because I think when we look at profitability, this is where some stakeholders get tripped up, and even product leaders get tripped. They look at profitability only coming from the new shiny object that they have to build. When in reality, the profitability can come from saving money because your internal processes are more efficient. You're able to get done more with fewer people. And in this economic climate, that's humongous. So we almost have to shift the mindset away from profitability comes not just from coming up with a new idea, but that profitability can come from how can we take our internal processes and be more efficient at it. We can save time, we can save money, we can save headcount, and that's got a pretty big impact on the bottom line. And so to that question in the Q&A, that's how we have to think about it. But in order to get there, and again, going back to even the basics of product management, you need metrics, right? You need to understand how long does it take. So that way you can answer the question, how much time am I going to save if I make that enhancement? I don't know, thoughts?
Yeah, I think, by the way, Joe, on that point, there's quite a lot of questions coming in, especially around I mean, Robin, correct me if I'm wrong here, like a lot about how to convince stakeholders. Like it looks like that's like a really, it's like it's a bubbling up theme of like, so it looks like we're hitting it. We're hitting a nerve.
But how do I convince my leadership that the baseline that we have today is not going to stay there, right? Like let's keep building on top of it, but what is the risk? How do I express the risk of doing nothing to our existing technologies and infrastructure and products while we are attracted to that new shiny thing? So yeah, any additional insight on how to have those conversations, what data to present, how do you help them really understand that risk?
So I have a lot of thoughts about stakeholder management in general. So it's a big topic in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that a lot of product teams get, I don't want to say wrong, but our challenge with is the notion of like data is going to win everything. And I might be slapped you on the wrist for saying that in a group full of product managers who love data, and I love data myself. So just don't get me wrong. But in many cases, when you deal with senior stakeholders, data could be confusing for them. In some cases, they could be feeling that they've seen a lot of data, but it might not be as convincing. And so I think the key thing, and this is like good old stakeholder management 101 kind of thing, is to understand who your stakeholders are and what actually motivates them. And really, before you decide on a single-handed, I have a one-size-fits-all way of convincing everybody in the world that I'm right, and it's with data. And there's a lot of people in the world who are not as data-driven as the others, and they might be more persuaded with stories, with anecdotes, with potentially with horror stories, or with actually taking them through the experience, right? So I know, for example, Amazon does this thing. I don't know if it does it anymore, but it used to do this in the past, at least, that when you joined Amazon, you had to do, I think, a week or 2 weeks in customer service. Like every employee in Amazon had to do that. I don't know if it's like still the same. And one of the reasons I love that is because it provides people with the actual experience that their end users are feeling as part of, and so what I strongly recommend for the product team is to try to find ways to animate. Let's say we're talking about the internal customer here, and you're trying to convince people to invest in the internal customer. Take them through forget about the data for a moment. Take them through the actual journey. In the case of Southwest, for example, of booking flight attendants, and just show them so that they feel the pain and potentially even the shame that they're leading a company whose processes are so messed up. And that might, and again, I'm not saying this is the wisdom of hindsight is not, it's not brilliant. But that might be more convincing than heaps of graphs and data points and any types of prioritization scoring or any of that nature. Like, just take them through the actual pain, show them the experience. And I think, so for me, if I were to recommend one thing, is really flex your muscle when it comes to how to convince. And think of your own life. How do you convince your partner or your kids if you have to do stuff? And it's not just with data. as far, at least not with my kids. I don't know. It's like I can't convince them just with data. So so for sure, try to flex your muscle in that sense. Joe, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, Herb Keller, who was one of the founders, I think he was the original CEO of Southwest. That's what he was known for. That's why people loved working for Southwest, because Herb would take the time to spend with the baggage handlers, with the flight attendants, with the people that are handling the scheduling system. And so, as they grew, that leadership grew further and further away from their internal customers. So I really love, you don't really know someone until you spend a day walking in their shoes, right? Elad, it's from one of the greatest books of all time, To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a quote that's will live on forever, and I think it holds true in this case.
No, absolutely, and I think one other thing comment to make about this is that the internal customer case is not just for like companies as big as Southwest. Like this is in all, I see that in all sizes of companies, and I really think that's like for everybody on the audience. I think this is something that I'm sure everybody feels this. Like a lot of people feel the pain in your company as well, even if you're like a 50 people or 100 people company. There's always an internal customer that can benefit from product, and so make sure that you are, to Joe's point, make sure that you're in their shoes, make sure that you feel their pain, and I think once you do, as a product manager, then you might have more empathy, and you might think, longer and harder when you do your prioritization, whether you want to do just progression, just this, or you want to mix it up and add some stuff that will help alleviate some of the pains inside the company. And it really is a balance, right? So it's not an easy balance to hit, but it is a balance that you need to hit in that sense.
But a couple of questions come in as well around user experience and user interface compared to, we've talked a lot about sort of that technical infrastructure type of debt, but how do you measure the cost of a poor UX? That's maybe it costs an internal customer 3 extra clicks to do something when it could be done in 1. And how do you measure the cost to a large organization like Southwest Airlines, even if you don't have a catastrophic failure because your employees are having to spend an extra 60 seconds to do a task? You're paying them for that 60 seconds. And how do you quantify how that adds up over time?
Elad, I'll let you take this one and I can add on to it.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll go ahead if you don't.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I think in terms of I mean, again, to kind of echoes also Joe's point, we're in an era now that profitability makes a lot of difference, right? So we're in an era now that making sure that the bottom line is important, and so actually doing some groundwork of quantifying how long does it take to do a task, and then doing the multiple. That's actually where data can actually be very beneficial, right? So actually doing, if I have 100 sales support representatives who are doing something that can take them a minute and it's taking them 10 minutes, and it's because I haven't invested in my internal customer, then that's a very easily quantifiable kind of thing to bring up and say like, hey, I think I can find a solution for this that would really save us a lot of time and hassle. And by the way, don't forget also, and that's one of the things that I'm sure Southwest is now learned the hard way, it also prevents churn. Like from employee churn. Eventually, if your internal customers, as in the employees of the company, are using archaic, painful tools on their day-to-day life, to do their job, and I can think of many jobs that have those tools. At some point, they might say, well, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. This is like too painful for. So and that cost is also massive for the company as well. So I would really take those 2 points in terms of kind of like time saved, and then quantify also the risk of churn and kind of like disgruntlement within those teams that we use systems that are old, and try to quantify that into a number that you can put in front of people, right? So I think that's really where actually data kind of like pops up and like becomes like a really powerful tool for convincing people.
There was a question in here. I was kind of, as Elad was going through that, there's a question here about personas. I want to go back to that one.
Sure.
And the question was, I thought personas are only for your external customers. And actually, what we stress is, personas can come in many different shapes and sizes. They can be your externally your person that's paying for your service or your good, but personas can also be for the buyer, the person that's making the decision. Personas are also for your internal customers. So they may not have to be as elaborate. When we talk about building personas in our workshops and in our training, we have like a nice pretty template with a picture and a quote. But at the end of the day, when we emphasize, getting to know your customers, it's really what are their goals and motivations and what are their pain points. We're human, right? And so getting a good understanding of what those pain points and those goals and motivations are. I even, you don't have to publish it like you would publish an external persona, but heck, I've done personas on the side for my stakeholders so that I know what are their hot buttons. I think Elad had even mentioned this earlier in the discussion. There's nothing wrong with that. They can be for anyone that's getting value from the product or service you're providing to them.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more, Joe. I mean, persona is definitely not just for the end user of a system or external customers. Absolutely an amazingly powerful tool for product managers to just like, and the extended teams that they're working with, to understand who are you building it for, what's the value that they're supposed to get from it, what are the pain points. All these things are critical for building products, and it's a very powerful tool, which is in many cases neglected, right? So, and we know that, Joe, that's like one of the things that we see a lot in companies, that they just like skip it, and they just like, I know the user, I know the persona, like I get it, and really that's the piece within product management of strategy that is so critical, so critical. And you don't have to, it's not like, and by the way, it isn't like a piece you do like on every week, you're going to update your personas on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, but it is critical to do it and to make sure that you cover everything around that, so that you have it, and that when you're building things, you're always going to revisit, you can revisit it, and you can train people to revisit it so that you can use it.
Absolutely. Well, and to that point, we, as product leaders, we represent the voice to the user, the voice of the user to the organization. And so what we have to do is we build that persona or that prototype persona, and then we go back and we validate it. We go and we talk to them, we walk in their shoes for a day or two. We do customer visits, do internal visits, go visit with your accounting team or your legal team or your sales team. I always, in my previous organization, I would shadow our sales team. There's always conflict with sales. For whatever reason, there's conflict with sales. And, at the end of the day, you get a lot of value. Just shadow them, see what drives them, see what they're getting tripped up on, and see if you can make their life a little bit easier. So you build that persona, but then you have to go back and validate and update it through those voice of customer techniques that we talk a lot about in our workshops and in our training.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, and I think I mentioned this in the previous webinar, one of my recommendations, and it's not always possible, but if possible, not just shadow, do. Actually,
absolutely.
Do their job. Go. If you're like, let's take the example of sales because it's a very easy one. I think a lot of product managers, they come to client meetings, but when they come as the product manager, as I always like to say, nobody wants to insult the guy who built the feature by saying to his face, this is a terrible feature. Like, I think this is horrible. It's very rare that humans would say that to a product manager. Put yourself in a position of somebody else, have a soda personality just for a couple of hours, and then try to see how people react to your speech. Then really powerful, really, I believe, really powerful thing to do for product managers, and something that's not commonly used, at least from what I've seen.
We got time for a couple of questions, Robin?
Yeah, so we've had several good ones come here. Let's see. Really great engagement in chat, by the way. This is good, lively conversations happening and folks sharing tips with each other, which I love to see. And a good question here are how good UX is about how easy it is for a user to understand something, which is a combination of good design and consistency. So how do you measure how well a user understands and comprehends the product. What can you observe that would help you with that, or if you have access to them, what would you ask them? When it comes to the usability of the product.
I mean, there are different techniques for this, right? I'll start off with this one, Elad. When I was online publishing, when we were releasing a new capability or feature, we would use user testing, and we would ask them to complete a given task, and we'd watch them. We'd record their mouse and see how long it would take for them to complete a given task. So it could be something as simple as that. That's more qualitative. But then there's also NPS scores. Are they referring you to their friends? Are they writing reviews about your product in Google Reviews? Or if you're a restaurant or you provide a service in Yelp or any other way to get that feedback, those are usually indications of satisfaction and happiness with your product. I don't know if Elad, you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I was about to say, we're kind of like 5 minutes to ending, and to start happy to talk about. I'm happy to open up the conversation as to how you do good UX testing, but it's probably not gonna. We're not gonna conclude it in the last 5 minutes. But very valid question. I would say, in the context of the internal customer, there is a little bit of the art of good enough, and I think that's where there's a little bit of, which is, by the way, I think is kind of interesting on its own. When you have when you are building for external customers, and UX, of course, to your point, Joe, is harder to measure, and then you have to do either qualitative or quantitative measurements, either by measuring events and telemetry of the product, or by qualitative, watching recordings, or even interviewing in usability testing, etc. With the internal customers, measuring UX in many cases is really it would be much more, I would say, probably much more qualitative than quantitative, with a lot of is there noise? And that's really the benefit of having an internal customer, because it's in your organization, so you can kind of talk to the leadership and talk to the people in in your company, and just ask, hey, is this process painful for you guys? Tell me more. And then, trust me, because it relates to their life and to their day-to-day job, they will share as much as you want and more about the pains from a UX or usability perspective about your internal products. So I would say, actually, funnily enough, in the case of internal customers and external customers, usability or UX is very differently measured, and actually easier. Fun, again, in the context of Southwest, it sounds kind of funny, but it's much easier to know. And Joe, I think you mentioned it earlier, everybody knew. Nobody was surprised when those systems collapsed, and eventually they moved into actually phone booking of staff. Very few people internally were very surprised about it, because they knew the system was not up to scratch, both from a technical debt perspective and from a usability perspective. So it was kind of you just have to talk to people rather than do a massive, complicated usability testing kind of thing.
All right. Well, we are coming up to the top of the hour, so I would like us to start to wrap things up here, and wanted to quickly mention our LinkedIn group. We did have a little bit of technical difficulties, folks. Thank you for bearing with us through this webinar today. But we also do have an offer for everyone because of that. As an appreciation, we're offering an exclusive discount on courses and self-studies to any of our attendees to take 25% off. Use the coupon code in the chat, grounded25, on any of 280 Group's courses to dive in more, right? We talk a lot about user experience and how to allocate technical debt and so forth. So join our LinkedIn community to continue the conversation. Like I said, I saw a lot of great conversation happening in the chat, and look forward to seeing it continue there. Any closing thoughts, Elad or Joe?
Joe?
I just think it goes back to empathy. Empathy with your users, your internal users, and empathy for your tech leads, your engineers, and understanding, they're trying to help you build and innovate. And we have to empathize and understand that in order to get there, we have to make investment in our time and that's in the form of tech debt. So next time you see your tech engineer, give that individual a hug and say thank you, because without them, you aren't successful in your job.
I can't top that, Joe. I can't. Hugging people is like, that's a good
virtual hug, Elad.
A virtual. I know. We're living it's all good. I'm just saying it's a good karma ending for this. So I think that's good for me as well. So cool.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks everybody, and thanks a lot
Thanks, everyone.
and thanks Robin for managing a lot of this very hectic and cool session. So.
Oh yes, we did have several comments about how we could do a whole session on user experience particularly in webinar clients.
Yeah, next one. All right.
All right. Appreciate everyone bearing with us, and again, great conversation. Really enjoyed this session. Let's go forth and see if we can be some change makers and think about tech debt and internal customers. So.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.